The sun was barely peeking through the Detroit skyline when a seasoned FBI agent started his day just like any other morning. He had this routine down to a science after 5 years at the field office. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., go for a quick jog around his neighborhood, shower, iron his suit, and head to work. His fellow agents often joked that you could set your watch by his arrival time, 7:45 a.m. sharp. This particular autumn morning felt special somehow. The air was crisp, leaves were starting to show hints of orange and red, and the agent had just closed a major case the day before. He'd spent months tracking down a sophisticated cybercrime ring, and the successful arrests had put him in high spirits. As he adjusted his tie in his car's rearview mirror, he couldn't help but smile, thinking about how his father would have been proud to see him now. His dad had been a beat cop for 30 years in Chicago, facing countless challenges as one of the few black officers in his precinct during the 1980s. Those stories of persistence and professionalism had shaped the agent's entire approach to law enforcement. "Keep your head high and your work spotless," his father always said. That advice had carried him through the FBI Academy and into his current role as one of the Bureau's top investigators. Pulling into the parking lot, he noticed the usual construction equipment blocking the main entrance. The building was undergoing major renovations, something about updating the security systems and modernizing the infrastructure. It had been going on for weeks now, forcing everyone to use the side entrance. He didn't mind. It actually saved him a few steps on his walk in. He grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, checked his appearance one last time, and made sure his FBI credentials were easily accessible in his breast pocket. Even after all these years, he never took for granted what that badge represented. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of trust, responsibility, and the culmination of years of hard work. The morning air had that perfect fall crispness as he walked toward the building. A few other agents were making their way in, coffee cups in hand, nodding hello as they passed. He waved to the usual maintenance worker who was sweeping leaves near the entrance. They developed a friendly morning ritual of exchanging weather comments. "Looks like rain later," the maintenance worker said, glancing at the clouds. "Better than yesterday's heat," the agent replied with a warm smile. As he'd approached the side entrance, he noticed something different. There was a new security officer he hadn't seen before, standing with an unusually rigid posture. The agent didn't think much of it initially. New faces weren't uncommon, with all the construction requiring extra security personnel. He reached for his credentials, a motion he performed thousands of times before. The weight of his service weapon at his hip, the familiar feel of his badge case, the sound of his shoes on the concrete. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. He had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, this ordinary morning would turn into one of the most significant moments of his career. His mind was already on his first task of the day, a briefing with his team about a new case involving a series of sophisticated bank robberies. He had some promising leads he wanted to discuss, and he'd spent part of last night preparing his presentation. The familiar buzz of anticipation that came with a new case was just starting to build. What happened next would not only change his day, but would end up transforming the entire department's approach to security and training. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the most unexpected moments, and this crisp autumn morning was about to become one of those pivotal times that remind us how a single interaction can spark a movement for change. The clock had just struck 7:45 a.m., and everything was about to change. Just as the FBI agent reached for the door handle, the new security officer stepped forward, his face set in a stern expression. "Stop right there," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made several people nearby turn their heads. The agent paused, surprised by the aggressive tone, but remaining professional as always. "Good morning," the agent said calmly, holding up his FBI credentials. "I'm heading in for the morning briefing." He'd shown these same credentials thousands of times before, but something felt different about this interaction. The security officer's body language was tense, his hand hovering near his holster, in a way that seemed unnecessary for a routine ID check. "This entrance is restricted," the officer replied, barely glancing at the credentials. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s, his uniform crisp and new, suggesting he'd recently transferred from another department. "You'll need to provide additional verification." The agent kept his voice steady, though he couldn't help but notice how the officer's eyes kept darting between his face and his hands, as if expecting trouble. "Sir, I've been working in this office for 5 years. These are valid FBI credentials, and I have clearance to use this entrance, especially with the main entrance under construction." Other employees were starting to slow down as they walked past, sensing the unusual tension in what should have been a routine exchange. The security officer shifted his weight, moving to completely block the doorway. "I don't care if you've been here 50 years. I said I need additional verification." The agent took a deep breath, remembering his father's words about staying professional no matter what. He reached into his pocket for his government ID, moving slowly and deliberately. "I'm happy to show you my additional ID, but I want to understand why my FBI credentials aren't sufficient this morning." The officer's face reddened slightly. "Look, I'm just doing my job. We've had issues with people trying to sneak in through this entrance." His emphasis on people wasn't subtle, and several onlookers exchanged uncomfortable glances. By now, a small crowd had gathered, maintaining a respectful distance but watching intently. The agent could see recognition on their faces. They knew exactly who he was, had worked with him on numerous cases. Some looked embarrassed, others angry, but all seemed unsure how to intervene. "Officer," the agent said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I understand the importance of security. I've dedicated my career to it. But I need you to explain why my valid FBI credentials, which have been accepted at this entrance every day for years, are suddenly insufficient." The security officer's radio crackled to life. Someone had called for backup. The situation was escalating unnecessarily, and the agent could feel his heart rate increasing, not from fear, but from the familiar frustration of facing such treatment despite his position and credentials. A young analyst walking by stopped in her tracks, coffee cup frozen halfway to her mouth as she watched the scene unfold. The agent had helped mentor her during her first year at the Bureau, and the look of disbelief on her face reflected what many were thinking. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the entrance. More employees were arriving, creating a bottleneck as they tried to navigate around the tense standoff. Some pulled out their phones, though whether to record or call for help wasn't clear. The security officer demanded yet another form of identification, his voice growing louder with each request. The agent maintained his composure, even as he noticed how the officer didn't stop a single other person entering the building. Not even those who had their badges partially obscured or were juggling coffee cups and briefcases. Just as the situation seemed about to reach a breaking point, the sound of rapid footsteps approached from inside the building. Someone with authority had finally been alerted to the situation, and they were about to witness exactly why this seemingly routine security check had become anything but ordinary. The sound of quick footsteps echoed through the hallway as the assistant director of the FBI field office rushed toward the entrance. She'd been alerted by concerned staff members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The morning sun caught her badge as she pushed through the growing crowd of onlookers. The FBI agent remained perfectly still, his credentials still held out, while the security officer continued his aggressive stance. Years of training and experience had taught the agent that sudden movements in tense situations could make things worse. He'd handled hostage negotiations and faced down armed criminals, but somehow this confrontation in his own workplace felt different. More personal, more frustrating. "I'm going to ask you one more time," the security officer was saying, his voice getting louder with each word. "Step away from the entrance and—" He stopped mid-sentence as the assistant director appeared beside him. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded, her eyes taking in the scene. The security officer straightened up immediately, recognizing her authority from her badge and demeanor. This is one of our top agents. He leads our cybercrimes division. The color drained from the security officer's face as realization hit him. His hand, which had been hovering near his holster, dropped to his side. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and whispers rippled through the group. Several people had their phones out, though they weren't recording. They were pulling up case files and news articles featuring the agent's recent successful operations. "Ma'am, I was just following protocol," the officer stammered, but his excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. "There have been security concerns with the construction and—" "Protocol." The assistant director cut him off. "Protocol is checking credentials, which were clearly displayed. Protocol is treating all personnel with respect. Protocol is not profiling our own agents." Her words were measured but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen this kind of situation too many times before. The FBI agent finally lowered his credentials, tucking them back into his pocket with steady hands. A younger agent in the crowd spoke up. He solved the Richardson case last week. It was all over the news. Others nodded in agreement, and more voices joined in, sharing stories of working with him on various cases. The security officer's face had turned from pale to red with embarrassment. His previous confidence had evaporated as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The morning breeze carried the sound of construction work from the main entrance, a stark reminder of why they were all using this side door in the first place. "Sir," the agent finally spoke, his voice calm and controlled despite the tension. "I understand you're new here. But what happened this morning isn't just about me. It's about trust, respect, and judgment. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with the same level of professionalism, regardless of what they look like." The assistant director nodded in agreement. "This incident will be reported and addressed appropriately. We've worked too hard building trust within our community to let something like this slide." She turned to the gathered crowd. "Everyone, please proceed to your duties. We'll handle this situation properly." As people began to disperse, many stopped to pat the agent on the shoulder or share a word of support. The young analyst from earlier approached him with tears in her eyes. "I've worked here for 2 years," she said quietly, "and you're one of the best agents we have. I'm so sorry this happened." The agent thanked her with a gentle smile, then turned back to the assistant director and the now subdued security officer. He knew what would happen next would be crucial, not just for him, but for everyone who worked in the building. The incident had shaken people's sense of belonging and safety in their own workplace, and that needed to be addressed. As morning briefings were delayed and rumors spread through the building, one thing became clear: this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Change was coming, and it would start right here, right now. The next few hours at the FBI field office felt like walking through thick fog. Everyone was talking about what had happened at the side entrance, but they kept their voices low, stealing glances at the agent's empty desk. He was now sitting in the assistant director's office, filling out an incident report with a kind of detailed precision that had made him one of the bureau's best. "Take me through it one more time," the assistant director said, leaning forward in her chair. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten during the last hour of discussion. "I want to make sure we document everything correctly." The agent nodded, adjusting his tie, a habit he'd picked up from his father years ago. "I approached the entrance at my usual time. Showed my credentials like I do every day. But something was different about how this officer reacted. It wasn't just extra caution. It was—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "It was like he already decided I didn't belong here." Down in the lobby, the security officer sat in a separate office, looking much smaller than he had earlier that morning. His supervisor stood nearby, reviewing security footage from the past week. The recordings told a clear story. Other agents, mostly white, had passed through that same entrance with barely a glance at their credentials. Some had even waved their badges from a distance and been waved through with a smile. The footage continued playing on the screen, and with each passing minute, the security officer's shoulders slumped further. He watched himself interact differently with various employees. Friendly nods to some, intense scrutiny for others. The pattern was undeniable, even to him. Back upstairs, word had spread beyond the building. The local FBI director had called in, expressing his concern and full support for a thorough investigation. Field offices across the country were being notified, not to spread gossip, but because this incident would become a teaching moment for the entire bureau. You know, the assistant director said, setting down her pen, 20 years ago, when I first started here, something similar happened to me. I was the only woman in my department, and a senior agent assumed I was a secretary. She smiled slightly. Things changed because people spoke up. They didn't let it slide. The agent thought about his father again, about all the stories he'd heard growing up. Change happens slowly, he said, but it only happens if we face these things head on. Outside the office, the daily work of the FBI continued. Agents analyzed evidence, made calls, and chased leads. But there was an undercurrent of conversation throughout the building. Younger agents gathered in break rooms, discussing their own experiences. Veteran agents remembered similar incidents from their early days, sharing stories they'd kept quiet for years. The young analyst from earlier had organized an impromptu meeting among the junior staff. If we see something wrong, she told her colleagues, her voice firm despite her nervousness, we need to speak up. We can't just stand there and watch. By early afternoon, the security officer's fate was becoming clear. The assistant director had reviewed his employment history. This wasn't his first incident of biased behavior, but it would be his last one here. However, the agent surprised everyone with an unexpected request. Instead of just firing him, the agent suggested, what if we turn this into something positive? He leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Let me talk to him. Sometimes people don't realize their biases until they're forced to face them directly. The assistant director raised an eyebrow. You want to talk to him? After how he treated you? I want to help him understand, the agent replied. Maybe that's what he needs, not just punishment, but understanding. Real change doesn't come from shame. It comes from growth. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows, plans were already being made. This incident would lead to new training programs, policy reviews, and honest conversations about bias in law enforcement. But first, there would be a conversation between two men, one who had faced discrimination his entire career, and one who was just beginning to recognize his own prejudices. The small conference room felt even smaller as the FBI agent sat across from the security officer. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, creating stripes of shadow across the table between them. Neither man spoke for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. I didn't expect this, the security officer finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. When they told me you wanted to talk, I thought it was a joke. His hands were clasped tightly on the table, his knuckles white with tension. The confident swagger from that morning was gone, replaced by genuine discomfort. The agent leaned forward slightly. Let me tell you a story, he began. When I was 12, my father came home from his police shift looking tired. Not the usual tired, something deeper. He sat me down and explained how one of his own colleagues had pulled him over in uniform because he looked suspicious driving through a nice neighborhood. That neighborhood was where we lived. The security officer shifted in his seat, unable to meet the agent's eyes. Around them, the office hummed with activity, but in this room, time seemed to stand still. I'm not here to shame you, the agent continued. I'm here because what happened this morning isn't just about you and me. It's about every person who walks through those doors feeling like they belong here, like they're part of something bigger than themselves. Down the hall, the assistant director was meeting with the department heads. They were reviewing security footage, not just from that morning, but from the past month. The patterns were clear and uncomfortable. Some employees sailed through security while others faced constant scrutiny, the differences falling clearly along racial lines. Back in the conference room, the security officer finally spoke up. "I've been in law enforcement for 15 years, he said, his voice stronger now. "I always thought I was one of the good ones. I never used slurs, never thought of myself as—" He trailed off, struggling with the words. "Biased," the agent offered gently. "None of us likes to think we are. But biased isn't always about conscious hatred. Sometimes it's about the split-second judgments we make without even realizing it." The officer nodded slowly, remembering how quickly he'd moved to block the agent that morning, how his hand had instinctively moved toward his weapon. "I keep replaying it in my mind," he admitted. "If you had been—" He paused again. "White," the agent finished for him. "You don't have to dance around it. That's part of the problem. We're often so afraid to talk about race that we never address the real issues." Outside the conference room, staff members walked past, stealing curious glances through the window. Word had spread about this unusual meeting, and opinions were divided. Some thought the agent was too forgiving. Others saw it as a powerful moment of potential change. The young analyst who had witnessed the morning's events sat at her desk, watching the conference room door. She'd been typing up her own account of what happened, determined that this incident wouldn't be forgotten or minimized. "I have a daughter," the security officer suddenly shared, pulling out his phone to show a photo. "She wants to be a police officer. I keep telling her she can be anything she wants. But after today—" His voice cracked slightly. "What if someone treats her the way I treated you?" The agent looked at the photo. A smiling young girl in a Halloween police costume. "That's exactly why we're having this conversation," he said. "Because your daughter deserves to work in a world where she's judged by her abilities, not her appearance. And so does everyone else." As they continued talking, the sun began to set outside the FBI building. The assistant director watched from her office as agents and staff left for the day, each carrying with them the weight of what had happened that morning. But something else was spreading through the building too, a sense of hope, of possibility. This wasn't just about one incident or two people in a conference room. It was about starting conversations that needed to happen, about facing uncomfortable truths, and about choosing to learn and grow rather than defend and deny. As the day drew to a close, it was clear that tomorrow would be different, not just for these two men, but for everyone who walked through those doors. The next morning arrived with a different energy in the FBI building. The internal affairs team had set up in one of the larger conference rooms, their tables covered with files and laptops. They weren't just investigating one incident anymore. They were looking at patterns across the entire department. "Look at these numbers," one investigator said, spreading out charts across the table. Over the past year, minority agents had been stopped for additional ID checks 3 times more often than their white colleagues. The data was clear, impossible to ignore, and uncomfortable to face. The FBI agent sat in on these meetings not as a victim, but as a voice of experience. "We need to understand why this happens," he explained, pointing to specific incidents. "It's not enough to just count the numbers. We need to know what people are thinking in these moments." In another room, the security officer was going through his own records. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his daily logs. Each entry told a story he hadn't wanted to see before. How he'd noted suspicious behavior for some people, but not others. How his reports used different language depending on who he was describing. "I never wrote anything offensive," he said to his supervisor, his voice heavy with realization. "But looking at it now, I can see how I viewed some people as threats before they even spoke to me." The young analyst had been asked to compile statements from other employees. People were coming forward with their own stories, small moments of prejudice they'd witnessed or experienced but never reported. Some were crying as they shared, finally feeling heard after years of silence. "I used to take the stairs instead of the elevator," one agent admitted. Because people would always check their phones or hold their bags closer when I got in. Others nodded, recognizing their own experiences in his words. By afternoon, the assistant director called an all-staff meeting. The large briefing room was packed, with people standing along the walls. The air felt thick with anticipation. What happened yesterday was a wake-up call, she began, her voice firm but caring. But it's not enough to just wake up. We need to change how we operate, how we think, and how we treat each other. The FBI agent stood up next, walking to the front of the room. Every eye followed him, remembering how he'd handled yesterday's confrontation with such dignity. I could have filed a complaint and walked away, he said. But that wouldn't solve anything. Real change happens when we're brave enough to have difficult conversations. The security officer was there too, sitting in the back. When the agent acknowledged him with a nod, others turned to look. Instead of hostility, they saw someone who looked different from the angry man of yesterday. Someone who seemed smaller, more human, and genuinely ashamed. I've spent my career worried about external threats, the agent continued. But sometimes the biggest threats to justice come from our own unconscious biases. We're all capable of making assumptions. The question is, what do we do when we recognize those assumptions? The meeting continued with announcements of new training programs, policy changes, and the creation of a diversity task force. But more importantly, people were talking openly about things they'd only whispered about before. In a quiet corner of the room, the young analyst watched as her coworkers shared stories, asked questions, and really listened to each other. She thought about how different this felt from the tense silence of yesterday morning. The security officer finally stood up to speak. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he talked about his own journey of realization. I always thought being professional meant being suspicious, he said. Now I understand that true professionalism means treating everyone with respect, regardless of how they look. As the meeting wound down, people lingered, forming small groups to continue the discussions. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting faces deep in conversation, sharing experiences, and really seeing each other, maybe for the first time. This wasn't just another mandatory meeting about diversity. This was the beginning of real change, sparked by one incident, but fueled by countless untold stories finally being shared. 1 week had passed since the incident, and the FBI agent found himself standing in front of a packed training room. The faces looking back at him weren't just from his own office. Security personnel from across the city had been invited to attend. The story of what happened had spread, and other departments wanted to learn from it. I'm not here to point fingers, he began, his voice steady and clear. I'm here because what happened to me wasn't unique. It happens every day, in every city, to people who don't have a badge to protect them. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly, drawn in by his words. In the middle of the room sat the security officer, now part of the presentation team. His transformation over the past week had surprised everyone. Instead of hiding from his mistake, he'd chosen to face it head-on. When he first asked me to help with this training, the officer shared, standing up, I thought he was crazy. Why would he want to work with someone who had treated him so badly? The agent smiled slightly, remembering their first conversation in that small conference room. Because change doesn't happen through punishment alone, he explained to the audience. It happens when we're willing to learn from our mistakes. They had spent days preparing for this session, reviewing security footage from various buildings, collecting stories from other officers and agents. Each example showed how quick judgments and unconscious bias could affect split-second decisions. The young analyst, now part of the newly formed diversity task force, operated the presentation slides. Each image told a story, not just about discrimination, but about opportunity for change. Look at these 2 photos, she said, pointing to security camera stills. Same person, different clothes. Notice how people reacted differently. The security officer stepped forward again. I used to think I was just being cautious, he admitted. But watching these videos, Seeing the patterns, it made me realize how my own fears and prejudices were affecting my judgment. In the back of the room, the assistant director watched with pride. What could have been a story of punishment and division had become something more powerful, a lesson in growth and understanding. The agent shared a personal story that made the room go completely quiet. Last month, I was shopping for my mother's birthday, he said. A security guard followed me around the store for 20 minutes. When I finally showed him my FBI badge, he apologized. But I kept thinking, what about all the people who don't have a badge to show? People in the audience started nodding, some sharing knowing looks. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps remembering times they'd done something similar. The hardest part of addressing bias, the agent continued, is admitting it exists within us. It's not about being a bad person. It's about recognizing patterns we've learned without realizing it, and then choosing to change them. The security officer then shared about his daughter again, but this time with a different perspective. I want her to grow up in a world where she judges people by their actions, not their appearance, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And that change has to start with me. They had created practical exercises for the training. Scenarios played out on screen, asking officers to examine their initial reactions. Why did certain people seem suspicious? What assumptions were being made? The discussions were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. Near the end of the session, a young security officer raised his hand. I've been doing this job for 3 years, he said, and I never thought about how many times I've made snap judgments based on nothing but appearance. This training, it's making me see things differently. As the session wrapped up, people didn't rush to leave. They stayed, forming small groups, sharing their own experiences and insights. The agent watched these conversations unfold, feeling a sense of hope. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about creating lasting change. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. But in those shadows, something bright was growing: understanding, empathy, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. 3 months after the incident, the changes in the FBI building were impossible to miss. The main entrance renovation was complete, but something more important had been rebuilt: the way people treated each other. The morning security checks had become a model of respectful professionalism, with every person receiving the same courteous treatment. The FBI agent walked through the doors one morning to find a small crowd gathered in the lobby. They were watching a news crew setting up their equipment. Your training program is going national, the assistant director told him, beaming with pride. Other agencies want to learn from what we've done here. The security officer, who had chosen to stay on after completing his own sensitivity training, now helped train new officers. See how I used to stand, he would say, showing security footage from that fateful morning. My hand near my weapon, my body language aggressive. Now watch how different it looks when I approach people with respect first. The young analyst had been promoted to lead the new community outreach program. She organized meetings between law enforcement and local communities, creating spaces for honest conversations about bias and trust. What happened that morning was awful, she often said, but look at all the good that came from it. In the break room, agents who had barely spoken to each other before now sat together, sharing stories and experiences. The walls that had invisibly divided them were crumbling, one conversation at a time. Yesterday, I stopped myself, one officer shared during their weekly discussion group. I was about to ask someone for extra ID, and I had to ask myself why. Was it really suspicious behavior, or was I making assumptions based on how they looked? The FBI agent's father had come to visit the office, proud to see how his son had turned a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for change. In my day, he told the gathered staff, we just had to take it. But you've shown there's another way, that we can face these issues head-on and make real change. The security footage from that morning was now part of their regular training, but with a surprising twist. They also showed what happened after: the conversations, the changes, the growth. It's not just about what went wrong, the agent would explain. It's about how we make it right. Even the building itself felt different. New signs had been put up, not just about security protocols, but about respect, dignity, and the importance of treating everyone fairly. But the real changes weren't on the walls. They were in people's attitudes and actions. One day, a young black man came in for a job interview. The security officer greeted him warmly, checked his ID efficiently, and sent him on his way with a genuine smile. Later, they found out he'd been watching the old security footage just that morning, reminding himself of how far he'd come. The FBI agent's case closure rate had actually improved over these months. When you're not carrying the weight of feeling unwelcome in your own workplace, he explained to a reporter, you can focus all your energy on the job. The assistant director had started receiving calls from other government agencies. How did you manage to change the culture so completely? They would ask. Her answer was always the same. We didn't just address one incident. We addressed the root causes, and we did it together. During one afternoon session, a veteran agent stood up to share something. I've been here 20 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And this is the first time I felt like I can be completely myself at work. The room fell silent, understanding the weight of his words. As the day wound down, the agent looked out over the city from his office window. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, reminding him of something his father used to say. Change is like the sunrise. It starts slow, but once it begins, nothing can stop it. In the lobby, the security officer was training a new recruit. Remember, he said, our job isn't just to protect this building. It's to make sure everyone who walks through these doors feels safe, respected, and welcome. 1 year had passed since that autumn morning when everything changed. The FBI agent stood at a podium of a national law enforcement conference, looking out at a sea of faces from agencies across the country. The security officer sat in the front row, no longer the same man who had blocked that entrance a year ago. Change isn't just about one moment, the agent began, his voice carrying through the packed auditorium. It's about what we choose to do with that moment. Behind him, a screen showed photos from the past year, training sessions, community meetings, and small everyday moments of people treating each other with newfound respect. The room was filled with police chiefs, FBI directors, and security officials who had flown in from every state. They had all heard about the Detroit model of bias training and how one incident had sparked a transformation that was spreading across departments nationwide. Last week, the agent continued, a young woman came to our office for a job interview. She told me she'd seen a news story about what happened here, about how we turned a negative incident into positive change. She said that's why she wanted to work with us, because we didn't just talk about change, we made it happen. In the audience, the young analyst who had witnessed everything from the beginning wiped away tears. She now led diversity training programs at 3 different agencies, sharing the lessons they'd learned that year. The security officer stood up to speak next. A year ago, I was the problem, he said honestly. Today, I'm part of the solution. And let me tell you, this side feels a whole lot better. The audience laughed softly, appreciating his candor. They showed video clips from security cameras across the country, before and after implementing their training program. The difference was clear. Officers and agents interacting with the public showed more respect, more patience, and most importantly, more consistency in how they treated everyone. My father used to tell me that real change happens slowly, the agent shared, but looking back at this year, I disagree. Real change happens as fast as we're willing to let it happen. We just have to be brave enough to face our mistakes and learn from them. The assistant director joined them on stage, sharing statistics that made the audience sit up straighter. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 85%. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. Even crime-solving rates had improved, thanks to better cooperation and trust between law enforcement and communities. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, she said. The real change is in the small moments. The conversations in break rooms, the way people greet each other in the morning, the trust that's built when everyone feels respected. A police chief from Texas raised his hand. We've been trying to address these issues for years, he said. What made your approach different? The agent looked at the security officer, then back at the audience. We made it personal, he answered. We stopped talking about bias as something other people have and started looking at our own behaviors. And most importantly, we showed that change doesn't have to come from punishment. It can come from understanding. As the conference drew to a close, people lined up to share their own stories, to ask questions, to learn more. The agent noticed how the conversations were different now. Less defensive, more open, more focused on solutions than excuses. The security officer's daughter, now a year older, had drawn a picture that hung in their training room back in Detroit. It showed people of all colors wearing badges, working together. Below it, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "My dad helped make things better." Standing there, looking out at all the people ready to take these lessons back to their own departments, the agent felt something he hadn't expected. Hope, pure and simple. The incident that could have ended his career had instead started a movement. Remember, he said in closing, every morning when someone walks through your door, you have a choice. You can see a threat or you can see a person. Choose wisely, because that choice might just change everything. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just clapping. It was the sound of commitment, of people ready to take these lessons home and make their own changes, one interaction at a time.